When you look at those really old antique maps, the ones from centuries ago where the parchment is all yellowed and fading.
Oh yeah, the ones with the elaborate sea monsters drawn right into the corners.
Exactly. You're tracing the coastline, following the ancient trade routes, and then you look out at the edges of the known world, and it literally just says, "Here be dragons."
Right, with these terrifying giant squids just swallowing ships whole.
Yeah. And for centuries, people just accepted that. They thought, well, it's off the map. We don't understand what's out there. We don't have the technology to navigate it. So it must be magic. It must be monsters.
It is entirely human nature. I mean, when we don't have the tools to understand the geography or really the reality of any complex situation, we tend to fill in the blanks with folklore.
Because it's easier.
Right. Exactly. It is actually comforting to say, oh, it's magic, because that absolves us of having to understand the actual mechanics of the unknown.
But then, human knowledge progresses. You get a satellite image of that exact same coordinate. And suddenly, that mythical dragon that swallowed ships is revealed to be, well, just a really treacherous geopolitical storm.
Right, like a jagged reef system with weird tidal currents.
Yeah, the magic disappears, sure. But the reality is actually so much more fascinating and so much more complex than the dragon ever was.
Oh, absolutely.
So, for you listening right now, today we are taking a satellite image to one of the most famous, most deeply mystified narratives in history. We're diving into some incredible analytical research by Allama G.A. Parwez.
Specifically, we're looking at his fourth lecture in a series that takes the journey of Prophet Moses in Surah Al-Kahf, which is verses 58 through 82.
Right, and he essentially reads it like a declassified intelligence dossier.
It really is a complete paradigm shift. I mean, what Parwez does here is strip away centuries of this mythological accumulation.
So no magic wands.
No magic wands. Instead of a mystical folklore about immortal beings, you are going to discover a masterclass in geopolitical intelligence, social physics, and the unyielding natural laws of history.
We are basically trading the fairy tale for a blueprint on how societies actually operate. But let's set the stage here first, because to understand why Moses is even going on this journey, we have to understand exactly who he is at this specific moment in the text.
Right. Context is everything.
Exactly. This is his pre-prophethood phase. He's not the man standing at the edge of the sea with a staff yet. He is living right inside the palace of Pharaoh, the absolute epicenter of a global superpower.
But he is from the oppressed class, the Israelites.
Yeah, so he is surrounded by this exploitative, tyrannical system that treats human beings like expendable machinery, and the text describes his psychological state beautifully. He is restless.
He has this intense inquisitiveness.
Right, he's entirely dissatisfied with the status quo, and he's desperately searching for the ultimate truth of how to dismantle this oppression.
That psychological baseline is just crucial. And it's something people often skip over to get to the magic parts of the story.
They just want the dragons.
Exactly. But Parwez points out that Moses isn't just looking for personal spiritual comfort. He's looking at the mechanics of a massive oppressive empire.
He sees the surface level of the suffering, right? Like the slavery, the daily injustice, the brutality.
Yeah, but he's a brilliant mind.
Yeah.
He knows there is a deeper machinery at work that he doesn't yet fully comprehend. He's asking, why do empires stay in power?
How do you actually subvert a system that has a total monopoly on violence and resources?
Right, so he needs a teacher. Not a mystic, but someone who understands the deeper structural laws of how societies rise and fall.
Which brings us to the folklore. Because if you grew up hearing this story, or if you've ever read classical commentaries on it, you probably heard the popular image.
Oh, the famous Khidr story?
Yes. Prophet Moses goes on this epic, mythical trek to find a secret, immortal green man named Khidr. And this guy supposedly drinks the water of life. He knows the future magically, and he performs these incredible magic tricks.
Like bringing a fried fish back to life.
Yeah, and magically fixing collapsing walls with a wave of his hand. It's pure fantasy novel stuff.
And here is where Parwez's rationalist thesis completely shatters that framework. Because if you actually look at the original text, just the text itself, stripping away all the secondary literature, it is shocking.
What does it say?
Well, the text never, not once, names this character Khidr.
Wait, hold on. You're telling me the name Khidr, which is globally associated with this story, isn't even in the verses we're talking about?
It is entirely absent from these verses. The text simply refers to him as a servant from among our servants.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and furthermore, the text attributes absolutely zero magical powers to him. He isn't described as an immortal. He isn't described as a being made of green light who drank the water of immortality.
So what is he described as?
The text describes him as an entity that possesses two specific things from the divine system. First is Ramalt, which translates to grace, mercy, or protection. And second is Ilm, which means knowledge.
But centuries of tradition have treated him as an individual magical person, like a specific guy. If he's not a magical wizard, who or what is he in Parwez's analysis?
Parwez argues that this guide actually represents a school of thought, or a specialized institutional body.
Like an intelligence apparatus.
Yes, exactly. An apparatus that thoroughly understands the long-term macro-historical laws and social physics established by the divine.
So it's an entity that operates based on deep strategic insight into how the world actually works beneath the surface.
Right. Moses isn't looking for a wizard. He's seeking out an underground academy of structural foresight.
Realizing this completely changes how you read every single line of this deep dive. But let me push back a little here.
Go for it.
Because I can hear people listening to this and saying, okay, but the text specifically says he has special knowledge from the divine. Mystics have used that exact phrasing for centuries to say, see, it's magic.
Right, the hidden knowledge argument.
Yeah, they say it's esoteric, hidden knowledge that you can't learn from a book.
And that is exactly the argument literalists make. They lean heavily on the term used for this knowledge, which is ilm Ladunni.
And how is that usually translated?
Traditionally, this gets translated as a magical, unwritten download of knowledge straight into someone's brain from the heavens.
Like downloading a file into the Matrix.
Exactly like that. But Parwez deconstructs this by looking at how the Quran uses language elsewhere. He argues it signifies deep, institutional, applied insight.
How does he prove that?
Well, to prove this, he draws a brilliant parallel directly from another part of the text regarding the training of hunting dogs.
Okay, you're going to have to walk me through that one.
All right.
Comparing divine wisdom to training a dog. Isn't that a bit reductive for a holy text?
It sounds jarring at first, sure, but stick with the linguistic mechanics of it. There is a verse that discusses the lawfulness of food caught by hunting animals.
Like falcons or hounds.
Right. The text describes these animals as being trained and specifically says they learn from what God has taught you.
Okay, so let's break that down. Did God magically download a tracking algorithm into the dog's brain?
Obviously not, right?
No, the human trainer spent months working with the animal.
Exactly. The human used their God-given intellect, their observation, and their deep institutional knowledge of animal psychology to train the dog to track prey and retrieve it without eating it.
So the human learned the natural laws of canine behavior.
Yes, which are divine laws of nature, and applied them. Parwez argues that ilm Ladunni functions the exact same way on a macro scale.
Oh, I see.
It's an applied, profound understanding of the natural laws and social physics that govern the world.
It's knowing how the geopolitical and economic systems work so intimately that your actions might look like magic to someone who doesn't understand the mechanics.
Precisely.
Okay, so it's expertise, not enchantment. Like how a master coder typing a few lines of script looks like a wizard to someone who doesn't know what a computer is.
That is a perfect analogy.
Okay, so Moses and his own companion set out to find this source of institutional knowledge. And this brings us to the actual journey, which starts with a really specific geographical marker, Ayat 60.
Right, the meeting of the two waters.
Yeah, Moses says he will not give up until he reaches Majma al-Bahrain. Literally translated, that means the meeting of two waters or two seas.
And you have people who have spent lifetimes looking for a magical geographical GPS coordinate for this.
They argue, oh, it must be the exact spot where the Red Sea meets the Mediterranean. Or it's where the salt water meets the fresh water.
Right. They treat it like an ancient tourist spot. But Parwez counters this by applying a deeper linguistic and political terminology.
How so?
In classical Arabic, the root word for sea, bar, isn't just about water. It is historically used to describe anything vast.
It's like a vast desert.
Or a vast intellect. A person with vast knowledge is called a bar. And crucially, a vast empire or civilization is referred to as such.
Oh, wow.
So if we strip away the literalist geography, Majma al-Bahrain represents a massive geopolitical convergence zone.
Like a borderland where two massive empires collide.
Exactly. Think of it as the friction point of opposing civilizations. It is the exact place where the structural cracks in a society are beginning to show due to the pressure of competing powers.
It's a volatile, highly charged political theater.
Yes. If you are looking for an underground institutional body that understands how empires operate and fail, you don't look in the comfortable center of the capital city.
You look at the edges.
You look at the convergent zone where the system is
Got
under
it. Oh.
stress.
Okay, so Moses is entering a covert theater of action, a highly volatile border region. But that brings up the absolute weirdest detail of this entire setup, the fish.
Ah, yes, the hoot.
Right. The folklore tells this incredibly elaborate story. Moses and his companion packed a fried, salted fish for lunch. They sit down near a rock, and suddenly the cooked fish magically comes back to life.
It jumps out of the basket.
It jumps out of the basket and swims away into the sea, leaving a magical, solid tunnel in the water. I mean, how on earth does Parwez explain a zombie fish using political intelligence?
By aggressively dismantling the linguistic assumptions behind it, Parwez calls the magical fish narrative Zeb-e-Dastan.
What does that mean?
It's an Urdu and Persian literary term for storytelling embellishment. It's the poetry of myth obscuring the historical reality. Let's look at the Arabic word hoot.
Yes, it means fish, right?
It does. But in the context of ancient travel, salted or dried fish was the standard, non-perishable travel provision.
It was simply their rations.
Exactly. They were traveling through a tense region, they stopped near a prominent rock, they rested, and they simply lost their food.
It slipped out of their pack.
Or they accidentally left it behind in the water while washing.
Okay, so they lost their lunch. But here's what I don't get. Why does the text make such a big deal out of it?
What do you mean?
Well, when they finally get hungry later on, the companion says, "Oh man, I forgot to fish the rock." And Moses doesn't say, "Well, that sucks, now we starve."
Right, he reacts completely differently.
He reacts with incredible urgency. He says, "That is exactly what we were looking for." Why is forgetting a dried fish the ultimate clue?
This is where you have to think like an operative, not a tourist.
Okay.
When you are operating in a covert, high-stakes environment where you don't have a map and you're looking for a hidden institutional contact, your supplies, your logistics, and your physical markers are everything.
So the rock wasn't just a random boulder.
No, it was a designated physical landmark. Losing the provisions there wasn't just a clumsy mistake. Parwez argues it acted as an operational code or a logistical indicator.
So it's like a dead drop in espionage.
Exactly. The fact that they let their guard down and lost their provisions at that specific landmark indicated they had reached the boundary of the safe zone and entered the convergence zone.
When the companion realizes they left the fish at the rock, Moses instantly deduces that they have overshot their intended rendezvous target.
They walked right past the entry point into this covert theater.
So the fish isn't magic. The location where they lost the fish is the exact coordinate for the rendezvous.
Yes.
It's like telling someone, if you reach the gas station and realize you don't have your keys, you've got a mile too far. Go back to the bridge.
That's a great way to put it. They retrace their steps using their own footprints, and right at that juncture, that is where they meet the guide.
The representative of this institutional body.
Exactly.
Okay, this is where the narrative really kicks into gear. They meet the guide, and Moses, who is desperate to learn the mechanics of dismantling Pharaoh's oppressive system, basically asks for an apprenticeship.
He says, "Can I follow you so you can teach me this structural insight?"
Right. And the guide's response is immediate. And it's basically a warning. He says, "You will not be able to have patience with me."
And he's right, it's really interesting. Parwez breaks down the Arabic linguistics to explain why Moses won't have patience.
It hinges entirely on the profound difference between two words, right? Kabar and kubra.
Yes.
Walk us through that mechanism, because this feels like the absolute engine of reason for the rest of the narrative.
It is the end. If you don't understand these two words, the rest of the story looks like absolute chaos.
Okay, let's break them down.
In Arabic, khabar literally means news or surface-level information. It's what you can perceive with your immediate senses.
It is the physical event happening right in front of your eyes.
Exactly. Kubra, on the other hand, comes from a root that implies testing or knowing the internal hidden state of a thing.
So it's much deeper.
It is deep experiential insight. It is structural foresight. It's understanding the long-term causality, the economic pressures, and the historical forces behind the event.
Okay, so Kabar is the breaking news headline. Stock market drops 500 points.
Yes.
And Kubra is the 50-page economic analysis explaining the decades of fiscal policy, supply chain fragility, and consumer debt that caused the drop.
That is a perfect analogy. And the guide tells Moses, how can you have patience for something about which you do not have Kubra?
Because Moses, coming from the outside, only has access to the Kabar.
He is looking at things from a purely reactive, legalistic, short-term viewpoint.
He is driven by short-term emotion, which is, entirely understandable given his righteous nature.
But the guide operates on long-term strategy. This sets up the famous contract of patience.
Which is that Moses is allowed to follow, but he's strictly forbidden from questioning any action until the guide decides it is time to explain the kubra behind it.
A contract which Moses immediately shatters.
3 times. Let's dig into these 3 tests, because this is where Parwez takes what everyone thought was magic and completely deconstructs it into applied social physics.
It's fascinating. Let's look at the escalation.
Right. They start by getting on a boat with some poor laborers. The guide takes an action that seems completely unhinged.
He damages the boat.
He physically pulls out a plank, compromising the vessel, and Moses reacts with pure, immediate kabar.
He says, "What are you doing? These people were kind enough to give us a ride, and you vandalized their property. You're going to drown us all."
It's a completely rational, emotional response to the surface-level information.
It is entirely rational if you are only looking at the kabar. To Moses, this is wanton destruction of property. It's unjust.
But what is the strategic reality? What is the kubra that the guide explains later?
The guide represents the unyielding, cold reality of macro-historical laws. In that specific geographical region, there was an exploitative king.
A tyrant running a militarized state.
Yes, and this king was preemptively seizing all perfect, fully functional boats for his naval fleet.
So the state is basically running a forced confiscation program, robbing this poor community of laborers of their only means of economic survival.
Exactly. The state inspectors were moving through the region, seizing assets.
And by damaging the boat slightly, executing a preemptive disruption, the guide rendered the asset undesirable to the state.
The king's men would see a broken plank, deem the vessel defective for state use, and just pass it by. They wouldn't confiscate it.
And the laborers, once the threat had passed, could easily repair a single plank.
But the crucial thing is, they gotta keep their primary capital asset.
What looked like malicious vandalism to Moses was actually a highly calculated strategic act of economic preservation. It saved the community's livelihood.
Exactly.
Okay, I can wrap my head around that. Damaging a boat to save it makes perfect economic sense. It's like scratching your own car so a thief thinks it's not worth stealing. I'm with you.
But the text doesn't stop there.
No, it does not. The stakes escalate drastically. We go from a broken plank to the loss of human life. And this is the part of the story that has made people deeply uncomfortable for centuries.
They leave the boat, and the guide executes a youth.
Moses' reaction is exactly what yours or mine would be.
Hmm.
Absolute visceral outrage. He says, "You just killed an innocent boy. This is a severe, unforgivable crime."
If the boat was vandalism, this looks like flat-out cold-blooded murder.
And this is exactly where literalist interpretations historically stumble, and where the magic excuse is used as a crutch.
So absolutely. Literalists often paint the guide as having this magical, divine permission to just kill an innocent child because God told him the child might grow up to be bad.
Which turns God into a preemptive tyrant, like something out of a dystopian sci-fi movie, Minority Report style.
Exactly. But Parwez contextualizes this heavily within the legal, social, and linguistic framework of the time.
Okay, lay it out for us.
First of all, the Arabic word used for the young man, gulam, does not exclusively mean a little child playing in the street.
Right.
It can refer to a young man in the prime of his physical strength. More importantly, Parwez looks at the descriptive terms used later.
What are they?
This individual was what in South Asian legal terminology is called an ishtihari mujrim,
A proclaimed offender.
a dangerous fugitive. He was rebellious, he was an extortionist, and he was a severe, violent threat to the social fabric.
But wait, how do we know he was actually a threat? Doesn't history show us that oppressive regimes like Pharaoh's, which Moses is trying to escape, constantly label anyone they don't like as extortionists or threats just to justify killing them?
That's a really valid concern.
How is the guide any different here?
That is a phenomenal question, and it gets to the very core of Parwez's analysis regarding institutional justice versus rogue violence.
Okay.
The text specifically highlights that this youth was bringing ruin to his own righteous parents.
He was forcing them into a state of rebellion and disbelief.
Meaning, in a practical sense, his violent criminal enterprise was either going to implicate his innocent parents in severe state crimes or utterly destroy them through extortion. He was a cancer on the community.
That makes sense, but it still seems like a vigilante killing on the surface.
But here's the most critical piece of the puzzle, and it directly answers your pushback. Parwez notes a massive historical mistranslation by literalists regarding the guide's authority to act.
A mistranslation.
Yes, literalists often translate the guide's later justification as, "I did not do this of my own accord. God whispered to me to do it."
Right, the God told me to do it defense.
Exactly. But Parwez points out that the actual Arabic phrase used in the Quran is "wa ma falatuhu an amri."
And what does that actually mean?
Well, literalists translate an amri as my own command or whim. But in classical legal Arabic, amr refers to jurisdiction, authority, or institutional power.
Wait, so how does Parwez translate it?
Parwez translates this as, "I did not do this outside of my jurisdiction."
Whoa.
Yeah.
So he wasn't acting as a rogue vigilante or a hitman taking orders from a voice in his head.
No. The guide representing this institutional body was acting under recognized regional legal authority.
He had the explicit jurisdiction to execute a dangerous, proclaimed criminal to prevent wider societal destruction.
It was capital punishment carried out by a legitimate structural authority against a known violent threat.
But Moses, being an outsider, an alien to this region's legal system, only saw the immediate physical act of the execution. He only saw the kabar.
He reacted with profound emotional outrage, completely blind to the legal jurisdiction and the systemic generational threat the youth pose.
He was blind to the kupa.
Precisely.
That is heavy. But it completely changes the framework. Moses thought he was witnessing a murder, but Parwez is arguing he was witnessing the harsh, unyielding reality of a functioning justice system protecting a vulnerable community from a predator.
Think about what this means for someone trying to dismantle an empire.
Right. If you are Moses trying to take down Pharaoh, you cannot just react to every surface-level event with pure emotional outrage.
If you want to build a just society, you have to understand the cold, hard mechanics of how to preserve assets, like the boat, and how to eliminate systemic threats within the bounds of legal authority.
Which leads us perfectly into the final phase of this journey. Because once you understand asset preservation and threat neutralization, you have to understand capital accumulation.
And that brings us to the mechanics of the collapsing wall.
Right. Ayat 82. After this incredibly intense execution, Moses and the guide enter a town. And the text makes a point to emphasize that the people of this town are incredibly hostile.
They are mean, they are stingy, and they flat out refuse Moses and the guide basic hospitality.
They won't even give them a scrap of food, which, if you know anything about the ancient world, is a massive violation of cultural norms.
To deny a traveler food is essentially an act of hostility.
So they are hungry, they're exhausted, they are dealing with hostile locals, and what does the guide do?
He spots a collapsing wall in this terrible town, and he decides to just roll up his sleeves and do free, grueling, manual labor to rebuild it.
And this is the moment Moses' contract of patience shatters completely and permanently.
Because it makes absolute zero sense on the surface.
Moses is looking at this and thinking, we are starving. These people despise us. If you're going to spend hours doing backbreaking masonry to fix their wall, at least demand a wage so we can buy some bread.
To Moses, this looks like complete subservience to an abusive system.
It looks like the guide is letting himself be exploited.
Which is exactly how surface-level kabar operates. It sees the immediate injustice of unpaid labor.
But when we look at this through Parwez's profound economic perspective, it becomes a masterclass in long-term capital management and social physics.
Exactly. When they part ways, the guide explains the kubra behind the wall.
What was it?
Yes, the wall physically belonged to the exploitative town. But underneath the foundation of that wall lay a reserve of asset capital, a hidden treasure.
And this capital did not belong to the corrupt townspeople.
It belonged to two orphans living in the city, whose father had been a righteous man who hid his wealth to protect it.
Okay, but if the goal is to help the orphans, why not just dig the treasure up right then and there, hand it to the kids, and say, here's your inheritance, use it to buy us some lunch?
Because they were orphans. They were vulnerable children. If the guide dug up the treasure, or if he allowed the wall to fall prematurely, exposing the assets, what do you think that hostile, exploitative community would do?
They would immediately plunder it. The kids wouldn't stand a chance.
Exactly. The orphans would be robbed and likely killed.
So rebuilding the wall wasn't a random act of charity for terrible people.
Nor was it subservience. It was a highly calculated, long-term, covert operation.
By rebuilding the wall, the guide secured this capital. He fortified its hiding place in plain sight.
The structural strategy was to keep the assets safe, locked away, and concealed until the orphans matured into strong adults.
Until they became a future generation of revolutionary workers who had the physical and social capacity to claim their rightful economic power.
And perhaps challenge the town's corrupt system.
That is incredible. It's social physics in action. He is safeguarding future capital.
The guide is basically acting as a covert trust fund manager for a future revolution.
He is willing to endure the short-term humiliation of unpaid labor, the physical hunger, and the insults of the townspeople, all to ensure that the long-term structural scaffolding is in place for the next generation.
And if we connect this all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, it ties perfectly into the very definition of that word we discussed, Rahmat.
Or divine grace and mercy.
Mercy.
But how does doing free labor for hostile people equate to divine mercy?
Because in Parwez's analytical paradigm, divine Rahmat isn't just about warm feelings or immediate forgiveness. It is about the strategic delay of consequences for a higher structural purpose.
Wait, explain that a bit more.
Think about the divine law of respite. How God often delays immediate punishment for an oppressive nation to allow time for the natural laws of reform or the natural buildup of consequences to play out.
Oh, I see.
The guide acts in accordance with this natural law. He delays the revelation of the treasure.
He denies the immediate gratification of finding the wealth, and he denies Moses the immediate gratification of getting a wage for food.
To ensure that the capital serves its rightful, long-term structural purpose.
True mercy, in a geopolitical sense, requires structural foresight.
Exactly. That completely flips the script on the entire narrative.
Moses thought the guide was being a fool for not taking a wage. But the guide was operating on a timeline that Moses couldn't even fathom yet.
Moses was operating in the span of an afternoon. I am hungry right now.
The guide was operating in the span of a generation. These orphans need economic leverage in 15 years.
Exactly. And this is the ultimate lesson Moses receives. When they finally part ways, the guide doesn't give him a magical wand or a secret spell.
He gives him a blueprint for systemic change.
Moses realizes that to take down Pharaoh's empire, he cannot be driven by the kabar, the emotional reactivity of the moment.
He must develop kubra.
He must learn how to strategically damage assets to save them from state confiscation.
He must understand how to utilize legal jurisdictional authority to neutralize violent threats.
And he must learn how to secure economic capital for the future generation, even if it means enduring temporary hardship and misunderstanding from his own people.
It really is a complete deconstruction of the mystic fairy tale. There is no magic water of life.
There is no teleporting zombie fish.
There are no wizards. There is just the brutal, brilliant, unyielding reality of geopolitical strategy, economic foresight, and the laws of social physics.
So this naturally leads to a massive question.
Right. If structural foresight demands that we look beyond surface events to safeguard resources for the future in a covert, underground way, what happens when a leader takes these exact lessons, scales them up, and actually achieves absolute material and engineering supremacy?
What happens when you aren't just an operative sneaking around border towns, but you are actually running the global empire?
That is exactly where Parwez takes us next. That is where the lens shifts from covert strategy and underground operations to overt, ethical, global governance.
And that brings us to the teaser for the next phase of this profound analysis. In Lecture 5 out of 9, spanning Ayat 83 to 101, we confront another legendary, heavily mystified figure in the Quran, Zulkarnain.
Just as we strip the magic away from the Khidr narrative, we are going to entirely deconstruct the mythical, impenetrable iron walls and the literal underground monsters associated with the Zulkarnain story.
We will lay bare Parwez's blueprint for the ethical management of an industrial, multi-continental superpower.
I absolutely cannot wait to dig into that. But before we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to leave you with something to chew on.
A final thought.
Yeah, something that takes this ancient geopolitical lesson and applies it directly to the screen you're probably looking at right now.
Think about the modern world.
Think about the algorithms that run our social media feeds, our news cycles, our entire digital lives. These platforms are scientifically designed by the smartest engineers on the planet to do exactly one thing.
Trigger your kabar.
Exactly. They feed you a never-ending stream of surface-level outrages, broken boats, and seemingly terrible, unexplained events to keep you in a constant state of emotional reactivity.
They want you angry, they want you commenting, they want you reacting to the headline, because that immediate emotional spike is what generates their ad revenue.
But as long as you are trapped reacting to the kabar, you will never develop the Kubra.
You'll be so exhausted by the daily outrage that you'll be entirely blind to the invisible long-term structural scaffolding being built around you by massive tech monopolies and global economic forces.
They are banking on you not having the patience to look beneath the surface. So ask yourself, are you just reacting to the surface news, to the monsters drawn on the edges of the map?
Or are you willing to pause, hold your patience, and actively seek the deeper Kubra?
The structural reality that shows you how the world truly works. Because the territory is always more complex than the dragon.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.